Hey guys, tonight we're diving straight into the icy heart of one of World War II's most perilous arenas, the North Atlantic. Picture this, a vast expanse of water, stretching endlessly between Newfoundland and the British Isles, where convoys of merchant ships brimming with vital supplies had to navigate treacherous waters teeming with German U-boats, bombers, and the harshest weather you could imagine. And here's the catch, the survival rate for these sailors. A grim 1 in 5. You heard that right. The odds were stacked against them from the very start. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, why not drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. I love seeing the night towel map light up. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. The North Atlantic was no ordinary stretch of water, stretching between Newfoundland and the British Isles. It was the lifeline for Britain during World War II. But that lifeline came with a price, a deadly one. For the merchant sailors tasked with bringing crucial supplies across the ocean, the journey was fraught with peril. The convoys were constantly under threat, not just from the weather, but from relentless attacks by German U-boats and Luftwaffe bombers. These weren't just ships crossing an ocean, they were targets, sitting ducks waiting to be picked off by the enemy lurking beneath the waves or soaring above in the skies. The sailors knew that every voyage could be their last. Convoys would depart from ports like Newfoundland, loaded with food, ammunition, fuel, and other supplies desperately needed to fuel the war effort in Britain. They had no choice but to brave the icy waters and the constant threat of attack, knowing that the enemy was never far behind. The German Navy had a relentless strategy. U-boats prowled below, waiting for the perfect moment to launch a torpedo. Above them, the Focke-Wulf Condors, long-range bombers, circled in the skies, ready to drop bombs on their helpless targets. And if that wasn't enough, the weather was just as deadly. The North Atlantic was infamous for its brutal, unpredictable storms, with gale-force winds and icebergs lurking in the dark. Every ship in the convoy was a target, and the Royal Navy escorts, while essential for protection, could only do so much. They'd try to defend the convoy from U-boats, but the submarines were incredibly difficult to detect. The bombers, meanwhile, could strike at any time, without warning, dropping deadly bombs that could tear apart an unprepared ship. The sailors on board knew they were walking a tightrope. Any moment could be their last. In the midst of this chaos, it wasn't just the military personnel who felt the pressure. The merchant sailors, many of whom were just regular men farmers, factory workers, and students before the war, had been thrust into this nightmare. They didn't sign up to be warriors, but they were. Their mission was simple: get the supplies to Britain, no matter the cost. These men didn't have the luxury of a fighting spirit developed through months of training. They had no choice but to step up and face the dangers head-on. They might not have been soldiers in the traditional sense, but they were every bit as brave. Every sailor aboard these ships knew that, statistically, their chances of surviving a single voyage weren't good. The odds weren't in their favor. You've heard it 100 times before, 1 in 5. 1 in 5 sailors would survive, the rest. They'd either be lost at sea, taken by the cold, or consumed by the violent chaos of battle. But they sailed anyway, because the mission was bigger than any one man's life. If they didn't sail, if they didn't bring those supplies, Britain's fight against the Axis powers would falter, and the war would take a turn for the worse. For the sailors, This wasn't just a job. It was a life-or-death gamble that required a rare kind of courage. Each time a convoy set out, it wasn't just a group of men embarking on a voyage. It was a group of men accepting the harshest reality. They were living on borrowed time, and every moment spent sailing toward their destination felt like a battle for survival. It was a long, grueling journey, but it was necessary. They had to survive, not just for themselves, but for everyone depending on them. But let's not forget the enemy they faced. The Germans weren't just sending U-boats after these convoys. They were sending their most skilled submarine captains, men who knew how to stalk their prey silently and strike without warning. The U-boats were predators of the sea, and their commanders were experts in the deadly game of cat and mouse that unfolded between them and the merchant ships. They knew how to stay hidden, to move in and out of range without leaving a trace. The sailors had to rely on their instincts and a few precious bits of technology to detect them, but even then, the U-boats had the upper hand. By the time they were detected, it was often too late. A single torpedo could cripple or destroy an entire convoy in seconds. Above the water, the Luftwaffe bombers were just as deadly. The Focke-Wulf Condors were long-range bombers designed to take out large ships, and they patrolled the skies above the convoys, swooping down with terrifying precision. The sailors below couldn't see them coming until it was almost too late. The sound of engines was a prelude to death. Bombs would fall from the sky, explosions would tear through the hull, and chaos would erupt. And as if that wasn't enough, the weather itself was a cruel adversary. Imagine being in a convoy, knowing that at any moment a storm could come out of nowhere. The North Atlantic wasn't known for being forgiving. The storms here were fierce, bringing waves so high they seemed to swallow ships whole. The freezing winds cut through sailors' clothes like knives, and the icy water, even in the best of conditions, was enough to freeze the blood in your veins. This wasn't just a battle against the enemy, it was a battle against nature itself. The odds were stacked against these men, and every voyage was a gamble with their lives. But despite the constant threat of death, despite the overwhelming odds, the sailors didn't give up. They couldn't. The war depended on them, and the stakes couldn't have been higher. The merchant sailors and their Royal Navy escorts weren't just participants in a campaign, they were the beating heart of the war effort, the ones keeping Britain's lifeline open. Without their courage, their sacrifice, and their refusal to back down, the entire war effort could have come crashing down. So, as these men sailed across the North Atlantic, they knew what they were up against. They knew the odds, but they sailed anyway. Because if they didn't, the world would be a very different place today. The battle for the North Atlantic wasn't just a struggle for survival, it was a battle of control. The Allies, desperately trying to supply Britain with the materials needed to fight the Axis powers, had to sail these deadly waters where every ship was a target. On the other side were the Germans, keen to cut off Britain's lifeline, using U-boats, aircraft, and even weather to their advantage. It was an all-out war beneath the waves and in the skies, and the stakes couldn't have been higher. Every convoy that set out from Newfoundland, bound for the British Isles, was effectively sailing through a gauntlet of destruction. The merchant sailors knew it. The Royal Navy escorts knew it. The Germans knew it. And yet, despite the grim odds, these convoys had to keep going. Without them, Britain would starve, and the war effort would collapse. The Allies couldn't afford to lose a single convoy, no matter the cost. In the midst of it all, there was no camaraderie more intense than that between the sailors. These weren't just crews and military personnel working together, they were brothers in arms. On these ships, friendship and trust were as essential as the supplies they were carrying. For some, this was their first real taste of war. They came from small towns, farms, and cities, drawn together by the need to protect everything they knew. Many would never return home. But in that brief, shared moment of survival, they were connected by something stronger than fear. As the convoys sailed, they were accompanied by Royal Navy escort ships, whose job it was to defend them from the deadly U-boats. These escorts were tasked with warding off the relentless submarine attacks that came in waves, often striking under the cover of darkness. The U-boats would wait until the convoy was in the perfect position, then launch a strike with pinpoint precision. Their torpedoes were silent but deadly. Once launched, they left no time for the sailors to react, just an explosion, a shudder, and a plunge into freezing water. And then there was the constant fear of being attacked by Luftwaffe bombers, who would swoop down from the sky like vultures, ready to drop their deadly cargo. The skies were darkened by their presence, and the sailors on board could only hope their escort ships could fend them off before they had a chance to strike. But often, the bombers were too fast, too numerous, and when they attacked, there was no escape. The survival rate for those aboard the convoys was grim, to say the least. On average, only 1 in 5 sailors made it out alive. You might think that these odds would deter the brave men who volunteered for these perilous missions, but in fact, it was the opposite. The sailors were ready to risk it all. In the face of overwhelming odds, they had no choice but to press forward, knowing that every hour they spent at sea could be their last. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Before the battle could even begin, these sailors had to contend with something even more immediate: the freezing cold of the North Atlantic. The temperature of the water often dropped below freezing, and the wind howled like a banshee, stripping away any warmth. For the sailors, falling overboard wasn't just a death sentence, it was a cold, merciless plunge into the dark depths of the ocean. The water temperature hovered around -1 degrees Celsius, and those who fell in wouldn't last more than a few minutes before hypothermia set in. There was no chance of survival. The only hope was that you'd be rescued before the freezing cold claimed your life. Even the most seasoned sailors feared what would happen if they fell overboard. If you went in, you didn't stand a chance. The freezing water would seize up your limbs, and in just moments, your body would shut down. You wouldn't be able to move, to scream, to fight. You'd just drift into the cold embrace of the ocean, waiting for a rescue that would never come. But falling into the water wasn't the only danger. The storms of the North Atlantic were legendary. Gale-force winds, towering waves, and the constant threat of icebergs made every journey feel like a gamble. The storm clouds that hung over the ocean felt like an ominous presence, as though the sky itself was conspiring against the sailors. Every creak of the ship's hull, every gust of wind that sent spray crashing against the deck, was a reminder of how fragile their situation really was. One wrong move, one unlucky strike, and it would all be over. And when you combine the bitter cold, the U-boats, the bombers, and the storms, you start to get a sense of just how perilous this mission was. It wasn't just about crossing the ocean, it was about surviving the ocean. Every time the convoy left port, the sailors knew there was a very real chance they wouldn't return, but they went anyway. It was their duty. And in the midst of it all, they had one goal: to get the supplies through. Without those supplies, Britain would be doomed, and the Allies would lose their fight against the Axis powers. It was a struggle for survival, not just for them, but for everyone fighting for freedom. Through the waves, through the storms, through the ever-present threat of death, these sailors pressed on. They had no choice. They had a job to do, and nothing would stop them from completing it. Whether it was facing down a German submarine or navigating through a snowstorm, they had to keep going. They had to keep fighting, because every mile brought them one step closer to victory. And if they didn't make it, well, the next convoy would. But through all the loss, the pain, and the hardship, something incredible happened. The men of the North Atlantic convoys didn't just survive, they became legends. Their bravery, their commitment, their refusal to give up made them the unsung heroes of World War II. Without them, the war could have been lost before it even started. And despite the overwhelming odds, these men kept sailing. They kept pushing forward through every storm, every attack, and every obstacle, because they knew what was at stake. And that determination would see them through the darkest hours of the war. The convoys, sailing under the constant threat of attack, were far more than just a logistical operation. They were a grim reality for the sailors who lived, ate, and slept with the knowledge that death could strike at any moment. But amidst this unrelenting danger, the bond between the men was something that transcended mere duty. It was survival. It was trust. It was brotherhood, forged in the most unforgiving of conditions. The sailors on these convoys came from all walks of life. Some were seasoned veterans, having fought in earlier battles or faced the dangers of the sea before. Others, however, were young men with little to no experience in war, simply fulfilling their duty to protect Britain from the Axis powers. They were farmers, students, and factory workers, many of whom had never seen a battle before. Yet, when the call came, they answered. They boarded the merchant ships with a sense of purpose. But the reality they faced at sea was far from what they had imagined. The harsh cold of the North Atlantic, the constant threat of attack, and the overwhelming isolation out in the open ocean began to wear on them. The days stretched on, sometimes lasting what felt like an eternity. There were moments of hope, brief glimpses of respite, but they were always fleeting. For most of the sailors, the only certainty was that the danger would come again and soon. The Royal Navy escorts, tasked with protecting the convoys from the U-boats and bombers, were often the first line of defense. These ships, despite their own vulnerability, would form a protective shield around the merchant vessels. Yet even the best-trained naval officers couldn't guarantee safety. The U-boats, with their stealth and deadly precision, had a way of slipping through the defenses, striking without warning. The bombers, too, were relentless in their pursuit, always circling above, waiting for the right moment to dive down and unleash their deadly payload. The threat of attack was constant. But it wasn't just the enemy that these sailors had to contend with. The conditions of the ocean itself were a constant adversary. The freezing waters, combined with the unforgiving winds, made every journey feel like a battle against nature. The ice-cold water of the North Atlantic was a death sentence to those who fell overboard. Temperatures regularly dropped to -1 degree Celsius, and if a sailor fell into those frigid waters, they had only a few minutes before the cold would incapacitate them completely. Hypothermia was the enemy that most sailors feared above all else. A man could be in the water for less than 3 minutes before the cold began to numb his body. Within minutes, his muscles would seize up, his vision would blur, and his senses would fade. If help didn't arrive quickly, he'd slip into unconsciousness and eventually drown. The mere thought of falling into those freezing waters was enough to haunt even the most battle-hardened sailors. The fear of being left behind in the cold, dark waters was compounded by the knowledge that, should a ship go down, the chances of rescue were slim. In the chaos of a convoy under attack, when a ship was struck by a torpedo or bomb, the survivors had to contend with the howling winds, the churning sea, and the imminent threat of other attacks. It wasn't just the loss of a ship, it was the loss of men, friends, and brothers in arms. The bonds formed in those harrowing moments were unbreakable. But even as the odds stacked against them, the sailors found ways to endure. They became adept at navigating the chaos, learning to read the signs of an impending attack, and preparing themselves for the worst. They trained, drilled, and bonded over the course of their voyages. Every man knew his place, and every man understood the stakes. They weren't just fighting for themselves, they were fighting for each other, for the men they had come to rely on, and for the victory that lay at the end of the journey. And yet, despite their bravery, there were moments when the sailors questioned whether they would ever make it home. With each attack, with each strike, the fear mounted. Every time they heard the distant hum of an enemy aircraft, or felt the ship shudder from a near miss, they were reminded that survival wasn't guaranteed. The constant tension was palpably each sailor silently bracing for the next attack. But there were stories that kept hope alive. Stories of near misses, miraculous escapes, and men who defied the odds to make it out alive. In those dark moments, when the water was freezing and the explosions were close, it was the hope of survival that kept them going. Every sailor had a story of someone they knew who had faced the same odds and lived to tell the tale. And though they all knew the odds weren't in their favor, that hope was enough to make them press on, even when every instinct told them to turn back. The danger was real, and the stakes were high. The convoys were carrying not just supplies, but the lifeblood of the war effort. If these supplies didn't make it through, Britain would be starved of the resources it so desperately needed to fight the Axis powers. Every convoy that sailed into the North Atlantic was a crucial mission. If they failed, the consequences would be dire, and the sailors knew it. As the convoys pushed forward, they became more than just a group of ships on a mission. They became a symbol of resistance, a symbol of endurance. They were a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming odds, there was always something worth fighting for. These sailors weren't just crossing the ocean, they were fighting for the future. They were fighting for freedom. And in the cold, harsh waters of the North Atlantic, their courage would be tested like never before. The ever-present threat of German U-boats and bombers cast a dark shadow over the convoys. As if the freezing cold and stormy weather weren't enough, the sailors on these merchant ships had to contend with a much more insidious enemy lurking just beneath the waves. The U-boats, stealthy and lethal, were designed to strike fear into the hearts of the Allies. They could remain hidden beneath the surface for days, moving silently through the water until they were in position to launch their deadly torpedoes. The sailors on the convoy ships knew that at any moment their ship could be the next target. When the torpedo struck, it wasn't just an attack on the ship, it was an assault on everything they knew. The explosion would tear through the hull, sending men flying, shaking the ship to its core. But the danger didn't stop there. As the ship sank into the freezing waters, Sailors who were lucky enough to escape the initial blast had only minutes to survive before hypothermia set in. The water was so cold it could freeze a man's body in minutes, leaving him unable to move, unable to fight, and ultimately unable to survive. For those who managed to survive the initial attack, the real battle began. The odds of rescue were slim. The convoys were hundreds of miles away from safety, and the stormy seas made rescue missions all the more difficult. Even if a ship went down in calm weather, the chances of rescuing survivors were slim. In the chaotic aftermath of an attack, there was often little hope of pulling anyone from the water. Still, the sailors pressed on. They had no choice. For them, survival wasn't just about getting through the next attack. It was about keeping the convoy alive. Every sailor had a job to do. Every task was critical to the mission, and no one could afford to falter. They had to trust in their training and the men around them. And as much as they feared the U-boats and the bombers, it was the fear of failing the mission, of not completing their duty, that haunted them the most. But the relentless assaults weren't confined to the waters. The skies, too, were a battleground. The Focke-Wulf Condors, long-range German bombers, had one mission: to destroy the Allied convoys. The bombers could strike from afar, dropping their deadly payloads on ships that had no defense. The sailors on the convoys could hear the engines of the planes before they saw them, a low hum that signaled death from above. The bombers would swoop in with terrifying speed, releasing bombs that would tear through the hulls of the ships. The crew had little time to react, and the results were devastating. The explosion would send debris flying, and in the chaos that followed, it was often impossible to determine who had survived and who hadn't. The fear of the bombers was nearly as paralyzing as the fear of the U-boats. The sailors could never be sure where the next attack would come from or when. It could be night or day, calm or stormy, but the bombers were always there, circling, waiting for the right moment. And when they attacked, it was with brutal efficiency. These bombers were designed to destroy large targets, and the convoys, with their valuable cargo, were exactly what they were looking for. On top of everything, there was the weather. The North Atlantic is infamous for its vicious storms, and for the sailors, these storms were as much an enemy as the German forces. Gale-force winds whipped the sea into a frenzy, and towering waves crashed over the decks of the ships. The cold was relentless, chilling sailors to the bone and making every movement feel like an effort against the elements themselves. Even if the convoy wasn't under attack, the conditions at sea were brutal enough to wear down even the most hardened sailor. Yet, despite all of these threats, the convoys pressed on. They had no choice. Britain was depending on these supplies, and the men on these ships knew it. They were more than just sailors. They were the lifeblood of the war effort. Without them, without the cargo they carried, Britain would have been starved of the resources it so desperately needed to continue the fight. There were moments when the sailors would look out across the vast, frozen expanse of the North Atlantic and wonder if they would ever see land again. It was a place where the sun rarely shone, where the wind never stopped howling, and where death seemed to be lurking at every turn. And yet, they kept going. Every day, they sailed forward, always with one eye on the horizon, and the other scanning the waters and skies for any sign of danger. The hope of survival was slim, but the drive to keep going was stronger than any fear. For the sailors, this wasn't just a fight for survival, it was a fight for freedom. The convoys carried more than just supplies. They carried the hope of victory. And that hope, no matter how fleeting, was what kept them moving forward. As the convoys pushed deeper into the North Atlantic, the sailors knew the worst was yet to come. The waters were becoming more treacherous, the skies more hostile, and the German forces were growing more desperate. The battle for control of the Atlantic was reaching its peak, and every convoy that sailed was part of that battle. Every time they left port, they were stepping into a new chapter of the war, where the outcome was uncertain and the risks were unimaginable. But despite it all, they kept going, because they had no other choice. The North Atlantic was a place of constant danger, but it was also a place of incredible bravery. The men who sailed these convoys were heroes, though they would never ask for the title. They didn't sail for glory or recognition. They sailed because it was their duty. They sailed because they knew what was at stake. And in that harsh, unforgiving sea, they proved that even in the face of overwhelming odds, courage could still shine through. As the war dragged on and the convoys continued their perilous voyages, the psychological toll on the sailors became as formidable as the physical threats they faced. While the enemy was a constant, omnipresent danger, whether it was a U-boat creeping silently beneath the waves or a bomb falling from the skies, there was something even more insidious at play: the crushing, gnawing fear of the unknown. Every sailor knew that at any moment their ship could be the next to be hit, and with it, their lives could end in an instant. The sense of dread was ever present, hanging thick in the air like the cold itself. The mental strain these men endured was immense. It wasn't just the violence of the attacks, but the constant, unrelenting tension that wore away at their nerves. They lived in a state of hypervigilance. Every time they heard a sound, a sudden engine noise, the splash of a wave, could it be a bomb or a torpedo? Every movement, every breath felt like it might be the last. There was no time to relax. There was no safe haven. And when the enemy did strike, the confusion was overwhelming. It wasn't just the physical damage. Every attack was a blow to the soul. They weren't just fighting to stay alive. They were fighting to keep their sanity. On top of the constant threat of death, the sailors also faced the psychological impact of seeing their comrades fall. Every loss hit hard. Every man who went overboard, every ship that sank, was a reminder of how fragile life was in those icy, dangerous waters. The bond between sailors became their lifeline. The men on these ships weren't just fellow soldiers, they were brothers in arms. And each time one of them was lost, the emotional weight grew heavier. It wasn't just about survival anymore, it was about honoring the memory of those who had already given everything. And for those who survived these attacks, the scars they carried weren't just physical. They lived with the trauma of the attacks, the grief of losing friends, and the constant, grinding uncertainty of their future. The battle for the North Atlantic wasn't just a fight against the Germans, it was a fight for the sailors' very souls. But even in the darkest moments, there was something that kept them going: the knowledge that their mission was too important to fail. They weren't just fighting for their own survival, they were fighting for the survival of Britain, for the survival of the Allied cause, and for the freedom of the world. That thought, though it offered little comfort in the moment, gave them a reason to push on. Yet, amid the terror of war, there were moments of unexpected humanity. In the middle of a convoy under attack, the sailors would look out for one another in ways that went beyond mere duty. A comrade might leap into the freezing water to save a fellow sailor, risking his own life to pull him from the abyss. Others, exhausted and broken by the strain, would encourage each other with whatever strength they had left. They would share stories of home, of what they hoped to return to, of the lives they would lead once the war was over. These small acts of kindness, these moments of shared humanity, were what made survival, however fleeting, bearable. And then there were the miraculous escapes. For every story of a ship being sunk, there was also a story of a sailor who survived against all odds. One survivor might have been thrown into the icy waters, only to be pulled from the sea by a passing ship hours later. Another might have been trapped below deck during an attack, only to escape as the ship sank, swimming to safety amidst the wreckage. These stories, although rare, offered a glimmer of hope. They reminded the men that survival was possible, that in the chaos of war, there was always a chance. The convoy battles were more than just clashes of military might. They were testaments to human endurance, to the will to survive. And in the face of the greatest adversity, these sailors showed what true courage looked like. Their heroism wasn't born from grand battles or glory, it was born from every moment they spent at sea, in constant fear of the unknown, yet still choosing to fight on. The attacks from U-boats and bombers were relentless, but as time passed, the Allied forces began to turn the tide. It wasn't just through military strategy or technological advances, although those played a crucial role. It was the sheer determination of the sailors and their escorts that eventually made the difference. The convoy system began to evolve, and the Allies learned how to better defend their vital lifelines. Improved radar systems, better coordination, and more effective use of air cover helped tip the balance in favor of the Allies. But even as the odds improved, the cost of victory was high. The sea still claimed many lives, but the sacrifices made in those dark, cold waters would ultimately help change the course of the war. But these victories came at a high price. The lives lost, the comrades who didn't make it, would never be forgotten. The memories of those who gave everything in the fight for survival would be honored by the men who survived. They would carry those memories with them long after the war ended, long after the convoy stopped sailing through the icy North Atlantic. They were the unsung heroes of World War II, men whose names might never be remembered, but whose bravery and sacrifice ensured the survival of the Allied forces. And as the convoys continued their perilous voyages, they became something more than just a battle for supplies. They became a symbol of the Allied resolve. Every sailor who boarded those ships, every man who risked his life in the freezing waters of the North Atlantic, became a symbol of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, the fight for freedom would continue. As the war finally wound down, the importance of these convoys was not lost on the world. The lessons learned, the bravery displayed, and the lives lost in the North Atlantic would be remembered forever. The sacrifices made during these dark, brutal months were integral to the eventual victory over the Axis powers. And in those final moments, when the convoys were no longer needed, the survivors would return home not just as soldiers, but as symbols of the resilience and courage that won the war. The battle for the North Atlantic was finally starting to shift in favor of the Allies, but the toll it took on the men who fought it could never truly be measured. For the sailors who survived the war, the memories of the convoys would remain with them for the rest of their lives. The constant fear of attack, the cold, the loss of comrades, and the sheer exhaustion of it all became part of who they were. They didn't just fight for victory, they fought for their very survival, and the survival of the world they knew. Their sacrifices, though largely uncelebrated at the time, became woven into the fabric of the Allied victory. When you look at the sheer magnitude of the struggle for the North Atlantic, it's easy to forget just how much of it was fought in the quiet moments. The small victories, the acts of kindness between men who had nothing but their wits and each other to rely on. These weren't grand, heroic battles on the front lines. No, this was a different kind of warfare. It was psychological. It was about enduring, day after day, without the luxury of knowing when it would end. And the men who sailed those waters, they weren't just soldiers, they were survivors. For those who made it out alive, the end of the war brought with it a mix of emotions. There was relief, yes, but also a sense of profound loss. They had seen the worst the world had to offer, and many had lost friends who would never come home. They returned to their homes and families, but they would never be the same. How could they be? The horror, the isolation, and the fear they experienced in those freezing waters left scars that would never heal. But in the years that followed, the importance of the North Atlantic convoys became clearer. The convoys had been a key factor in keeping Britain supplied with the resources it needed to continue fighting. Without them, the Allies may not have had the strength to push back the Axis powers. And the bravery of the sailors who made those journeys possible wasn't forgotten. Eventually, their sacrifices were recognized by the world, albeit belatedly. The men who had risked everything to keep the war effort alive were finally honored for their service, even if they never truly understood the full impact of their actions at the time. Their story became one of resilience and courage in the face of overwhelming odds. The convoys were a vital piece of the Allied war effort, but they were also a reminder of the human cost of war. It wasn't just about the battles fought on the front lines. It was about the battles fought by ordinary men who were thrown into extraordinary circumstances. The convoys were the lifeline that kept Britain in the fight, and the men who sailed them were the unsung heroes whose courage ensured that freedom would survive. The lessons learned from the convoys didn't end with the war. The need for cooperation, communication, and unyielding determination in the face of danger became principles that shaped the future of international relations. The men who survived the North Atlantic had shown what could be achieved when people worked together, no matter the cost. Their bravery became an example of what it meant to fight not for oneself, but for a cause greater than any individual. And in a world that would forever be changed by war, the legacy of their courage would continue to inspire generations to come. Even today, the story of the North Atlantic convoys is a testament to the power of the human spirit. The sailors who faced unimaginable danger every day, whose odds of survival were so slim, showed the world what it meant to endure. They gave everything, even when survival seemed impossible, because they knew what was at stake. And in doing so, they helped shape the course of history. As the years passed, the men who sailed those convoys grew older, their ranks thinned by time. But the stories of their bravery and sacrifice lived on. The convoys were a critical chapter in the history of World War II, and the men who participated in them became part of a larger narrative of struggle and triumph. They weren't just part of a war, they were part of the story of how the world survived, how freedom prevailed, and how ordinary people rose to meet the greatest challenges of their time. Now, as we remember the sacrifices made on those treacherous waters, it's important to reflect on the lessons we can learn from the North Atlantic convoys. It's a story not just of war, but of human strength, solidarity, and the power of perseverance. The sailors who sailed through the storm, who faced down danger at every turn, showed the world what it truly meant to fight for survival, for liberty, and for the future. And as we remember them, we honor their courage and the unbreakable spirit that carried them through the darkest of times. So, as the world has moved on, as the years have passed, and as the men of the North Atlantic convoys have grown old, let us never forget the sacrifices they made. Let us remember that, in the coldest, most unforgiving places, ordinary men did extraordinary things. And let that memory inspire us all to face our own challenges with the same determination, courage, and unyielding spirit that those brave sailors showed in the battle for the North Atlantic. The end of World War II marked a new chapter for many of the men who had survived the horrors of the North Atlantic convoys. For some, it was a return to normalcy, the quiet, simple lives they had left behind. But for others, the scars, both visible and invisible, would remain with them forever. They had seen too much, endured too much. War had a way of changing a man, of taking pieces of him that he could never fully recover. The North Atlantic convoys, the cold waters, the constant threat of death, it all left a mark that no amount of time could erase. For the families of those who had survived, the return of their loved ones was both a relief and a challenge. The men who came back were not the same as the ones who had left. The weight of what they had endured was too much for some to talk about. For many, their stories were left untold, hidden behind the silence that came with trauma. The horrors of the war didn't just disappear when the last shot was fired. They lingered, haunting the men who had sailed those perilous waters. In the years following the war, as survivors started to share their experiences, the significance of the North Atlantic convoys began to be fully recognized. The crucial role they played in sustaining Britain, in ensuring the Allies could keep fighting, became clear. And yet, despite the undeniable importance of their missions, many of the men who had participated in these convoys remained unsung heroes. Their bravery, their sacrifices, were often overshadowed by the larger, more publicized battles of the war. But in the quiet moments, they knew the truth. Without the convoys, the war might have turned out very differently. The convoys became a symbol of endurance, of unrelenting courage in the face of overwhelming odds. They were a reminder of what humanity was capable of when pushed to its limits. The sailors who had sailed those waters showed the world the true meaning of sacrifice, the power of brotherhood, and the will to survive against all odds. For those who lived to tell the tale, the convoys became a shared experience, a bond that connected them forever. They would meet each year at reunions and gatherings to remember their fallen comrades, to share stories, and to keep the memory of the North Atlantic alive. These gatherings were more than just a way to honor the past. They were a chance for the men to find comfort in knowing they weren't alone. They had fought side by side, and they would continue to support one another even as the years wore on. But as the years passed, the convoys faded into history. New generations grew up without fully understanding the significance of what had happened out on those cold, stormy waters. The men who had fought and survived the North Atlantic battles grew older, their ranks slowly thinning, yet their legacy remained. It wasn't just the victories they had achieved, was the lessons they had imparted, the unshakable belief that no matter how dire the situation, no matter how bleak the odds, it was always worth fighting for. As the men of the North Atlantic convoys aged, their contributions to the war and to history became more widely recognized. They were finally awarded the honors and recognition they deserved, their bravery and sacrifice celebrated by nations. Yet, despite the recognition, many still carried the emotional weight of what they had been through. The physical wounds of war had healed, But the psychological scars would never fade. For the families of the men who didn't return, the war was a constant reminder of what was lost. The men who had been left behind in the icy waters of the North Atlantic became part of a larger narrative, a larger memory of the cost of war. They were not forgotten, even though they never had the chance to tell their stories. The convoys, like so much of the war, were a chapter in history that was sometimes difficult to face. The sheer brutality, the courage, and the sacrifices made by the men who sailed those waters were almost too much to comprehend. But as time passed, their story began to be told, and their place in history was cemented. And for those who survived, the battle for the North Atlantic was not just a war story, it was a testament to the strength of the human spirit. It was a reminder that no matter how impossible the task, no matter how dire the circumstances, ordinary men could rise to the challenge and become heroes. Their courage, their perseverance, and their willingness to face the worst humanity could throw at them made them the true heroes of the war. They didn't wear medals or claim fame. They didn't ask for recognition. They did what had to be done because it was the right thing to do. The legacy of the North Atlantic convoys lives on in the stories passed down through generations. It lives on in the men who survived, in the families who supported them, and in the lessons learned from their sacrifice. It is a story of courage, brotherhood, and the unyielding determination to survive when survival seemed impossible. And so, as we remember the convoys, we also remember the men who sailed them. We honor their bravery, their sacrifice, and the unbreakable spirit that carried them through the storm. We remember that, in the darkest of times, even in the icy waters of the North Atlantic, humanity can rise to meet the challenge, and that, in the end, is what made all the difference. As the years passed and the convoys became part of history, the impact of their legacy only grew. For those who survived, the horrors they faced never truly disappeared. Time may have softened the edges, but the memories remained sharp, often resurfacing when they least expected it. The men who had sailed the North Atlantic convoys found themselves haunted by the things they had witnessed, by the faces of lost friends, by the chilling sound of the torpedo hitting the ship's hull, and by the endless nights spent drifting through a sea of darkness and fear. But they also found comfort in each other. The reunions, though bittersweet, were a chance for these survivors to connect, to share their stories, and to support one another. The emotional weight of what they had endured was too much for any one man to carry alone, but in the company of others who understood, it was easier to bear. These gatherings, filled with stories of courage and loss, became a sacred tradition. And in those moments, when they spoke of their fallen comrades, it wasn't just a way of remembering, it was a way of keeping their spirits alive. The convoys were a chapter in a larger global narrative, but for the men who had sailed through the terror of the North Atlantic, it was a deeply personal experience. Each voyage, each attack, each loss was a part of their soul. Even after the war, their story was inseparable from their identity. They had witnessed the worst of humanity, but they had also seen the best, the bond between men who had nothing to rely on but each other and the hope that they would make it out alive. For the families of these men, the war didn't end with the signing of peace treaties or the formal surrender of the Axis powers. It lived on in the stories told around dinner tables, in the quiet moments of reflection when the men thought no one was listening. The invisible scars, those emotional wounds, were carried home, where they were often left unspoken but never forgotten. The psychological cost of war, the trauma that came with it, wasn't something that could simply be erased by the passage of time. It was carried from generation to generation, passed on quietly, sometimes without even realizing it. But there was also healing in those stories. For every painful memory, there was a moment of pride, a moment when these men realized that their sacrifice had meant something. It had mattered. It had made a difference. The victory they had helped secure wasn't just a military one. It was a victory for humanity, for freedom. And though many of the survivors would never see their names etched in history, they carried something far more important: the knowledge that they had fought not for fame or glory, but for the survival of all. And over time, as the world moved further away from the war, the memory of the North Atlantic convoys began to fade from the collective consciousness. New generations grew up, and the details of those desperate sea battles were overshadowed by the larger events of the war. But for those who had lived through it, the convoys would never be forgotten. They would remain as vivid and as real as the day they had sailed through those waters, facing the constant threat of death. It's easy to overlook the quiet heroes in history, those who don't have statues erected in their honor or grand monuments celebrating their courage. The sailors who sailed those convoys were among the unsung heroes of World War II, and their story is one that deserves to be told again and again. Their bravery and sacrifice should never be forgotten. These were men who faced overwhelming odds and still managed to keep going. They didn't give up. They didn't back down. They did what had to be done, no matter the cost. And so, as we look back at the North Atlantic convoys, it's important to remember not just the battles fought on the surface, but the battles fought within. These men faced more than just U-boats and bombers. They faced the challenge of surviving the unimaginable, and they did it. They kept their heads high, kept sailing, and kept fighting for what mattered most: the survival of their comrades, the safety of their country, and the future of the world. The convoys were a turning point in the war, and the bravery displayed by those who participated is something that should be passed on to future generations. Their story, one of courage in the face of danger, of resilience in the face of loss, is a story we must never forget. Their sacrifice was not in vain. It was a testament to the strength of the human spirit and the unshakable will to survive, no matter the odds. As time moves forward, let us carry their story with us, remembering not just the horrors of war, but the extraordinary bravery of the men who endured them. They may have sailed into the darkness of the North Atlantic, but their legacy is one that will forever shine in the hearts of those who know their story. The convoys of World War II will never be forgotten, not by those who lived through them, and not by those who hear their story. As we reflect on the incredible journey these sailors undertook across the North Atlantic, it's hard not to wonder how they managed to keep going in the face of such overwhelming adversity. What was it that pushed them to endure the cold, the fear, the constant threat of death, and the isolation? Was it a sense of duty? Was it sheer determination? Or was it something deeper, a belief that they had no choice but to keep moving forward, no matter what? For many of the sailors, it was a sense of purpose that drove them. They understood that their role in the war was not just about them, it was about the survival of their country and the future of the world. The convoy missions were about keeping Britain alive, ensuring that the war effort didn't falter because of a lack of supplies. Every ship that made it through the North Atlantic, every piece of cargo that was delivered safely, was one small victory in a much larger battle. These men, who were often just regular sailors, knew that they were part of something far greater than themselves. But it wasn't just duty that kept them going. It was the camaraderie between the men. The shared experience of facing death together created bonds that were unbreakable. These sailors relied on each other, not just for survival, but for emotional strength. They knew that, in the darkest hours, when everything seemed lost, their brothers in arms were there to help them stay grounded. The bond between them was forged in the fires of war, and it became the lifeline that kept them from succumbing to the overwhelming pressure of the task at hand. In the moments when everything seemed to be falling apart, it was these bonds that provided hope. A sailor might look across the deck of his ship, catching the eye of a fellow crew member, and know, without a word, that they would face whatever came next together. When a convoy was under attack, when bombs were falling from the sky, when the ocean itself seemed to conspire against them, it was the unity among these men that helped them hold on. They didn't fight just for themselves, they fought for each other, for their families, and for the future. And that's where the strength of the North Atlantic convoys lay. It wasn't just in the ships, the radar systems, or the weaponry that guarded them. It was in the men who sailed them, the unyielding human spirit that could face down the worst dangers imaginable and still stand firm. Every time a torpedo struck, every time a ship was sunk, the sailors would look around and find new resolve in the faces of those who were still there. They didn't have time to grieve. There was no room for weakness. They had to keep going, and they did, again and again, until the convoy reached its destination or until it became one more casualty of the war. But even in the face of such sacrifice, there were moments of humanity that shone through the darkness. The small gestures, the shared rations, the quiet conversations as the ships bobbed on the freezing water, the laughter that would sometimes bubble up despite the grim circumstances, those were the things that kept their spirits alive. In the middle of war, in the middle of the worst possible conditions, these men found a way to keep their humanity intact. They didn't let the war strip them of everything. They still found joy, still found connection, even in the most unlikely places. And in the aftermath of the war, when the convoys had stopped sailing and the war had ended, the survivors returned home with a mixture of emotions. There was relief, of course, but also a sense of deep loss. Many of them had lost friends, men who had been by their side, men who had laughed with them, fought with them, and, in the end, died with them. The sense of camaraderie that had kept them going in the darkest hours was now gone. The world had moved on, but they carried the weight of those years with them. For many, adjusting to life after the war was a challenge. The memories of the North Atlantic convoys didn't fade. They couldn't. The fear, the loss, the constant tension, they stayed with them, embedded in their minds like an indelible mark. The men who had sailed those waters didn't just return home as survivors. They returned as men who had lived through something that most could never comprehend. They had seen the worst that the world could throw at them, and they had come through it, scarred but still standing. As the years passed, some of the survivors found peace. They went on to lead quiet lives, raising families, building careers, and finding joy in the simple pleasures that life had to offer. But for others, the memories never really faded. They were haunted by the men they had lost, by the ships that had sunk, and by the cold, dark waters that had claimed so many lives. The psychological toll of those years couldn't be washed away by time. It lingered, often in silence, but always present. Yet, even with the scars they carried, the men who had sailed the North Atlantic convoys knew that they had done something extraordinary. They had been part of something that had helped shape the outcome of the war. They had faced death every day, and still, they had fought on. The strength of the human spirit, when tested to its limits, had proven to be stronger than even the worst of adversities. And so, as the years turned into decades, the story of the North Atlantic convoys began to be told more widely. The men who had sailed those treacherous waters were finally recognized for their bravery. Their contributions, though often overlooked during the war, were now acknowledged as a key part of the Allied victory. The convoys had been an essential lifeline for Britain, and the men who sailed them had been the unsung heroes who had ensured that lifeline remained intact. As we remember the North Atlantic convoys, we honor not just the bravery of those who sailed them, but the courage it took to keep going, to never give up, even when the odds seemed impossible. These were men who faced down the coldest, most unforgiving waters in the world, and still they kept moving forward. They didn't stop, and because they didn't, the world was able to breathe just a little bit easier. Their legacy is one of courage, resilience, and the unbreakable will to survive. And that is a story that will never fade. In the decades that followed the end of the war, the men who had sailed the North Atlantic convoys became an enduring symbol of resilience and duty. Their bravery was not always recognized immediately, but over time, their place in history became clearer. The convoys had been more than just military operations. They had been lifelines, holding together the hopes of a war-weary Britain, keeping it alive through sheer grit and determination. The legacy of these men became a testament to the extraordinary courage of ordinary people thrust into extraordinary circumstances. They were not battle-hardened soldiers. They were farmers, factory workers, studentsmen who had no desire to fight, but understood that they had no choice. Their story wasn't about heroics on the front lines or dramatic victories. It was about survival in the face of constant, brutal attacks, about doing the job that had to be done, no matter the cost. These sailors didn't just sail across the North Atlantic, they crossed into the heart of history. The survival rates in these convoys were shockingly low, 1 in 5. That's what they were up against every time they sailed out. But despite those odds, the convoys kept running, the ships kept sailing, and the men kept doing what they knew they had to do. But the true cost of these missions wasn't just counted in ships lost or lives sacrificed, was also felt in the quiet aftermath, in the lives of those who returned home. Many of them found it difficult to reintegrate into civilian life. They had seen and experienced things that most people couldn't even begin to understand. The PTSD, the flashbacks, the constant fear of the next attack was something that stayed with them long after the war was over. And yet, they had to carry on. They had to keep moving forward, not just for themselves, but for the future generations they had fought to protect. For those who made it back to their families, the war wasn't something they could easily explain. The world had moved on, and many people, especially the younger generations, couldn't truly grasp what the sailors had been through. How could they? What did it mean to survive when every day felt like a struggle against the elements, the enemy, and your own fears? The scars, both physical and emotional, ran deep. And then there was the broader recognition, which came much too late. It wasn't until many years after the war ended that the vital role of the North Atlantic convoys and their sailors began to be properly acknowledged. Veterans of the convoys, who had long been overlooked, started to receive the recognition they so deserved. Plaques, medals, and ceremonies finally gave these men the honor they had earned in the cold, dark waters of the North Atlantic. But for many, it felt like a bittersweet recognition. What had been given in the form of accolades and ceremonies didn't undo the years of struggle, of being overlooked, of feeling like their sacrifices had gone unnoticed. Despite the long wait for proper recognition, the legacy of the North Atlantic convoys lived on. The veterans who returned home became living memorials to the courage and sacrifice of those who didn't make it. They told their stories, ensuring that future generations would understand the price of freedom, the price of survival, and the price of war. The convoys themselves became symbols of the unspoken cost of victory, the price paid, not just with lives, but with the mental, emotional, and physical toll that these men carried with them for the rest of their lives. The war may have ended, but for the men who sailed the convoys, the battle didn't stop when they reached home. It continued in their hearts, in their minds, in the quiet moments when they relived the horrors of the sea. Their journey, while ending in victory, was far from over. For the veterans who survived, it became their mission to ensure that the sacrifices of their fallen comrades were never forgotten. In their stories, in their memories, in the communities they built after the war, the legacy of the North Atlantic convoys lived on. They became part of a larger effort to preserve the history of the war and to pass it down to future generations. Today, we remember the North Atlantic convoys not just as a chapter in a history book, but as a story of human endurance, of unbreakable will, and of the price of freedom. These men, who faced the coldest, most brutal waters in the world, proved that even in the darkest of times, humanity could rise above. They proved that even when the odds were stacked against them, courage could still find a way. As we honor their legacy, we remember that their story is not just one of war, it is one of survival. It is a story of hope in the face of despair, of comradeship in the face of loss, and of the quiet strength it took to endure what most could never imagine. The North Atlantic convoys were a lifeline during one of the darkest periods in history, and the men who sailed them were the unsung heroes whose courage and sacrifice helped turn the tide of the war. Their story will never be forgotten, and their legacy will continue to inspire future generations to fight for what is right, to stand firm in the face of adversity, and to never give up, no matter how impossible the odds may seem. As the years marched on, the veterans of the North Atlantic convoys grew older, their stories passed down to new generations who would never fully grasp the magnitude of their sacrifice. For the younger generations, the battles fought on those freezing waters were distant memories, part of a history book, something that belonged to a time long gone. But for the men who had lived it, the convoys would always be a part of their everyday lives, etched into their souls like a permanent scar. Despite the passage of time, the memories never faded. The nightmares still came in the dead of night. The sound of explosions still echoed in their ears, and the cold, the unbearable, numbing cold, still gripped them, even as they sat in the warmth of their homes. The battles fought on the surface of the North Atlantic were over, but the war they had fought within themselves continued. Some survivors found solace in sharing their experiences with others, spreading the story of their time at sea, of the friendships forged under fire, of the losses they had suffered, and the extraordinary willpower that kept them going. Many of them would travel to reunions, meet with other veterans, and share stories that had been locked away for decades. It was cathartic, in a way, a chance to relive their past, but also to ensure that the next generation knew what had been sacrificed for the future they now enjoyed. But not all the survivors could bring themselves to speak. The trauma of what they had endured was too much to express in words. They had lived through things that were impossible to explain: the uncertainty, the isolation, the constant fear of death, and some of them carried that burden silently for the rest of their lives. The pain wasn't always visible, but it was always there, beneath the surface. And so, as the years turned to decades, the men who had once sailed those treacherous waters began to pass away, one by one. Their ranks thinned, and with each loss, a part of the story was gone. But as they left this world, they left behind a legacy that would never fade. The story of the North Atlantic convoys, of the men who risked everything to ensure victory, would continue to be passed down, remembered, and honored. They may have been the unsung heroes of World War II, but their bravery and sacrifice were no less significant than those who fought in the more publicized battles of the war. As time moved on, the importance of the North Atlantic convoys continued to grow in recognition. Military historians, researchers, and veterans organizations made it their mission to ensure that the sacrifices made during those years were never forgotten. They became the champions of the convoy's legacy, pushing for memorials, documentaries, and educational programs that would ensure future generations knew the full extent of what had been achieved in those freezing waters. But the true tribute to these men is not just in the memorials or the documentaries, it is in the continued freedom and peace that their sacrifices made possible. They sailed through some of the harshest, most unforgiving conditions known to man, not for fame or glory, but for the simple and noble cause of ensuring the survival of Britain and the defeat of tyranny. The freedom we take for granted today, the very safety we enjoy, is built on the backs of men who, against all odds, delivered hope to a world in peril. And so, the story of the North Atlantic convoys is a story of triumph in the face of the most daunting of challenges. It is a story of ordinary men who rose to do the extraordinary when called upon. Their bravery, their sacrifice, and their unshakable resolve helped turn the tide of war, and their story will continue to resonate through the ages. The men who sailed those convoys will forever be remembered, not as mere soldiers, but as the silent protectors of freedom. They may have sailed in the cold, unforgiving waters of the North Atlantic, but their legacy will always burn bright, a beacon of the strength of the human spirit. They showed us what it means to endure, to fight, and to persevere in the face of overwhelming adversity. Their courage is a lesson to us all, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there is hope, and there is always a way forward. The North Atlantic convoys were, in many ways, the backbone of the Allied war effort. Without the bravery of the men who sailed them, the course of the war might have been very different. And so, as we honor their memory, we remember not just the ships, not just the battles, but the men who made it all possible. The legacy of the North Atlantic convoys lives on, in every story shared, in every life touched by their sacrifices, and in the freedom we hold so dear today. As the world shifted from the turbulent years of war to the peace that followed, the men who had survived the North Atlantic convoys began to fade from the public's consciousness. The focus shifted to the great high-profile battles of the war, the beaches of Normandy, the air raids over London, and the storming of Berlin. Yet, the sacrifices made by the sailors of the convoys were still a vital part of the narrative. Behind the large headlines and iconic images, the smaller, quieter stories of survival, of men facing death daily on the cold, unforgiving waters, remained hidden in the shadows. But as time moved forward, the importance of the convoys became increasingly undeniable. The more historians and veterans themselves spoke out, the clearer it became. The success of the Allied forces was inextricably linked to the success of the convoys. These lifelines, stretching between Newfoundland, Iceland, and the British Isles, carried not only supplies, but the very will to win. Without them, the Allies would have been starved of the materials needed to keep fighting. In the years following the war, the convoys became a symbol of perseverance, endurance, and the sacrifices made by ordinary men who were thrust into extraordinary circumstances. It wasn't just the physical challenges they faced on the water, but the emotional and psychological weight that they carried. Every man who sailed those waters carried the memories of the attacks, of the ships that were sunk, of the comrades lost. It was a burden that many struggled to carry alone, but it was also one that bound them together. For the survivors, the impact of the convoys was never truly gone. The psychological toll they had endured remained long after the war ended. Some struggled with nightmares, flashbacks, and the haunting images of men who had fallen, their lives snuffed out in an instant by the merciless sea. Some found solace in their families, in the quiet moments of normalcy that came after the war. Others found comfort in the company of their fellow survivorsmen who, like them, had seen the worst and still carried on. These men didn't just survive the war, they had lived through the unimaginable. As the survivors aged, their stories became even more vital. They were the last living links to the past, to the convoys, to the unsung heroism that had kept Britain in the fight. But with every passing year, the number of survivors dwindled. The stories they told, once shared in crowded reunions and somber gatherings, became rarer and rarer. Soon, the only record left of the convoys would be the written accounts, the historical markers, and the memorials. But the true meaning of those stories, the emotional weight, the feeling of comradeship, of life on the edge of death, could never truly be captured in words. In a way, the fading of the survivors into history was a quiet reminder of the sacrifices they made. They had lived through something so harrowing that it couldn't be fully understood by those who had not experienced it firsthand. The war, in all its brutality, had shaped them in ways that were impossible to convey. The way the cold seeped into their bones, the way the sounds of bombs and torpedoes echoed in their ears long after the attacks had stopped the way they had learned to survive, not just physically, but mentally, in the face of constant fear and uncertainty. It's easy for history to focus on the larger battles, the grand strategies, the sweeping victories, but in doing so, we risk forgetting the everyday men who made those victories possible. The sailors of the North Atlantic convoys were the unseen backbone of the war effort, and their story is one that needs to be remembered. They weren't in the spotlight, they weren't the heroes everyone talked about, but without them, the war would have looked very different. They were the unsung warriors of the sea, and their sacrifices, though largely unrecognized in their time, were no less important than the actions of the soldiers who fought on the front lines. As we remember the North Atlantic convoys, we must recognize the incredible courage and perseverance it took to survive in such conditions. The men who sailed these convoys were more than just sailors. They were symbols of resilience, of human strength in the face of unimaginable adversity. Their story is not just a story of war, but a story of survival, of what it means to endure when the odds are stacked against you. These men didn't do it for the glory, and they didn't do it for recognition. They did it because it was necessary. They did it because the world needed them. They did it because the fight for freedom, for survival, was too important to quit. And in the end, their actions helped shape the course of history. The North Atlantic convoys were a chapter in the broader story of World War II. But they were also a testament to the unbreakable spirit of the human will. Even in the face of overwhelming odds, the men who sailed those convoys showed the world that survival is about more than just staying alive. It's about finding strength when all seems lost, about holding on when every instinct tells you to give up. And now, as we remember their story, we honor not just their bravery, but the sacrifices they made to ensure that freedom would survive. The men who sailed the North Atlantic convoys may have been forgotten by many, but they will never be forgotten by those who understand the true cost of war. Their legacy lives on in every story shared, in every life saved, and in the peace that their sacrifices helped to secure. As time marches on, the story of the North Atlantic convoys, once a whisper in the historical narrative, has begun to find its rightful place among the most critical chapters of World War II. Yet, for those who were part of it, the journey never truly ended. The men who sailed those perilous waters may have returned home to quiet lives, but they remained haunted by the memory of the war and the comrades they had lost. For them, the ocean was not just a battlefield, it was a place of brotherhood, sacrifice, and, most often, unspoken grief. The quiet heroism of these sailors didn't come with parades or medals. Their reward wasn't fame, but survival. Yet, for many, survival was its own kind of trauma. The emotional scars they carried were just as real as the physical wounds they had endured, but they were invisible to most. No one outside the military understood what it meant to hear the distant roar of an incoming Focke-Wulf condor, or to feel the cold embrace of the Atlantic water after a torpedo strike. The freezing waters that had claimed so many lives were a constant reminder of what could have been. And for those who survived, it was a haunting reminder of the comrades who hadn't. Returning to normal life after the war was challenging, not just for the veterans, but for their families as well. How could anyone truly understand what they had been through? The wives, the children, the friends they didn't know the weight of the cold wind on their faces, the desperation of seeing a ship go down in the distance, or the way the memory of that sound, the distant rumble of bombs and torpedoes would stay with them forever. It was a silence that followed them, unspoken and yet always present. And so, these veterans found comfort in each other. It wasn't just about camaraderie, it was about survival. Their shared experience, their shared trauma, created a bond that was unbreakable. They knew what it meant to lose someone in an instant, to live with the constant tension of never knowing if they would make it through another day. They shared stories, told jokes, and kept each other grounded. In their company, they didn't have to explain themselves. They didn't have to say anything. They simply understood. Over time, as more and more veterans passed away, the story of the convoys began to fade into history. The memory of their sacrifice was at risk of being lost. But that's where the younger generations came in, the children and grandchildren of those who had fought. They became the torchbearers of the legacy, ensuring that the history of the convoys would never be forgotten. These stories were passed down, sometimes told around the dinner table, sometimes shared in history classrooms, and sometimes in quiet moments of remembrance at reunions. The importance of these convoys was finally being acknowledged, and with that came the recognition that these men were more than just survivors. They were the foundation on which the victory was built. Without their bravery, without their sacrifices, the outcome of the war could have been very different. They were the unsung heroes, and their story needed to be told. In the final years of their lives, many of the veterans found solace in the knowledge that their sacrifices would not be forgotten. They had seen their stories told in documentaries, written in books, and commemorated in memorials. Their courage had finally been recognized, and they had earned the recognition they deserved. But it wasn't just about recognition. It was about knowing that they had played a crucial role in changing the course of history. They had stood at the crossroads of life and death, and by sheer will, they had kept the lifeline open. For those who had passed before receiving their due recognition, it was too late. But the survivors, though few in number, became living monuments to the bravery and sacrifice of the convoys. Their stories lived on in the memory of the war, in the education of the next generation, and in the shared history that connects us all. They had fought not for the glory of battle, but for something much greater, the survival of a world that had been on the brink of destruction. As we look back on the legacy of the North Atlantic convoys, we are reminded of the price of freedom. We are reminded that the greatest acts of heroism are often the quietest, the most understated. These men didn't seek fame, they didn't seek fortune. They sought only to do their duty, to protect what they loved, and to ensure that the war effort did not falter. They fought for a cause larger than themselves, and in doing so, they became part of something eternal. The North Atlantic convoys were a turning point in the war, and they were a turning point in the lives of those who sailed them. They proved that even in the darkest, most hostile places, humanity can rise above. They showed that even in the face of overwhelming odds, there is always hope. Their legacy is one of courage, brotherhood, and an unyielding will to survive. And though they may no longer sail those icy waters, their story will continue to inspire and be remembered for generations to come. For the survivors, the North Atlantic convoys were more than just a chapter in history. They were a defining moment in their lives. The bravery, the camaraderie, the fear, and the sacrifice, they all lived on in their memories and in their hearts. And as we remember their story, we honor them. We honor their courage, their strength, and the unbreakable human spirit that carried them through the darkest of times. The North Atlantic convoys were not just a lifeline for Britain, they were a lifeline for humanity. And the men who sailed them will forever be remembered, not just for what they did, but for who they were. As the final survivors of the North Atlantic convoys grew older, the world continued to change, but their legacy remained an essential part of history. The battles they fought, not just against the enemy, but against nature, against fear, and against time, would continue to echo in the collective memory. The scars they carried, both visible and hidden, were markers of a time when the world was at war, and men were tested in ways few could ever imagine. Though the North Atlantic convoys may not have been as widely celebrated as some of the other monumental events of World War II, their impact was no less significant. Without the unrelenting determination of those sailors, those unheralded heroes, Britain's ability to sustain itself through the darkest days of the war would have been gravely compromised. The convoys were the lifeline, and those who sailed them made the difference between victory and defeat. Their stories, though often forgotten, were the quiet undercurrent that ran through the broader narrative of World War II. In the years following the war, many of the men who had endured the harrowing convoys sought to move on with their lives. The war was behind them, but it was never truly gone. The men who had sailed those deadly waters faced an unspoken challenge to carry on with normal lives despite the extraordinary events they had experienced. For some, it was easy to slip into civilian life. They returned to their families, to their jobs, to the comfort of peace. But for others, the weight of their memories was too much to bear. The emotional scars, the trauma, the guilt, the grief remained with them, lurking just beneath the surface. They had witnessed death and destruction on a scale few could comprehend. They had seen comrades go down with the ship, watched as ships were obliterated in explosions, and heard the screams of men lost to the icy depths. Yet they were the ones who survived. They were the ones who kept going when everything seemed lost. And in the years that followed, some of them would carry the pain, the loss, and the trauma of the war in silence. There was no closure for many of them, no formal acknowledgement of what they had been through or the toll it had taken on them. They had been asked to face horrors that the rest of the world would never understand, and even as history began to remember their role in the war, they often felt as though their suffering was invisible. But as time passed, there were efforts to ensure that the sacrifices of these men would never be forgotten. Veterans associations, historians, and military groups worked tirelessly to make sure that the story of the North Atlantic convoys was told correctly and comprehensively. The veterans themselves, though fewer in number, began to share their experiences more openly, ensuring that future generations understood the significance of their mission. As the survivors grew older and the number of those who could tell the story dwindled, there was a sense of urgency to preserve their experiences, to capture the moments that had shaped the outcome of the war. It wasn't just about the ships or the convoys themselves. It was about the lives that had been affected, the men who had risked everything, and the price they had paid. The memorials, the documentaries, and the stories told in books and classrooms were efforts to immortalize their bravery. Yet, no amount of recognition could undo the trauma of war. No amount of accolades could erase the painful memories of comrades lost, of ships sunk, or of lives forever altered. The men who survived the North Atlantic convoys bore those burdens with quiet dignity, but the emotional cost was something that could never be fully understood by those who hadn't lived through it. They had witnessed a part of humanity's darkness that would forever stay with them. Still, the recognition came. The survivors received medals, honors, and thanks long after the war was over. The governments that they had fought for began to acknowledge the debt they owed to these unsung heroes. But for the men who had sailed those dangerous waters, the most important recognition was knowing that their mission had mattered, that their courage had made a difference. The supplies they delivered had kept Britain in the fight, and without their efforts, the war's outcome could have been entirely different. For those who made it home, life had to continue. They married, had children, and built new lives. Yet, in the quiet moments, when the world was still, they would remember. They would remember the fear, the freezing cold, the screams of men in the water, and the heart-stopping moments when they thought they might not make it, but they did. They made it. And their survival, their sacrifice, was the cornerstone of a victory that would shape the future of the world. As the years turned into decades, the story of the North Atlantic convoys became more than just a historical event. It became a symbol of the courage and resilience of the human spirit. These men had sailed into the heart of danger, and though many did not return, the legacy of their bravery lived on. They were the silent defenders, the unsung heroes who helped win the war, and their story was one that would never be forgotten. Today, the North Atlantic convoys are remembered not just as a wartime necessity, but as a testament to the strength of ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances. The men who sailed those waters may no longer be with us, but their legacy lives on in the peace they helped secure, in the freedom they fought for, and in the stories that continue to be shared. Their story is one of perseverance, sacrifice, and courage in the face of overwhelming odds. It is a story that should be told over and over to remind us of the cost of freedom and the unbreakable spirit that can rise to meet the darkest challenges. As the years continue to pass, the North Atlantic convoys, though a quiet chapter in the larger story of World War II, stand as a profound testament to the sacrifices made by countless men. Their story, too often relegated to the margins of history, is finally beginning to take its rightful place among the tales of wartime heroism and survival. But the journey these men went through, facing unimaginable dangers, living through freezing conditions, and contending with the constant fear of attack, cannot be fully captured by history alone. It's something that, in its purest sense, lives in the memories of those who survived it. What many of us don't realize, as we read books or watch documentaries, is how profoundly these men were affected. The convoys were more than just a war mission. They were a microcosm of humanity's greatest struggle. The sailor's duty wasn't just to the ship, to the mission, or to the military leadership. It was to his fellow crewmen. The convoys weren't just about transporting supplies. They were about ensuring that survival, in all its forms, would persist. And that sense of brotherhood, that unbreakable bond between men who depended on each other in the most dangerous circumstances, is something that transcends time. The passage of time has softened the sharpest edges of the past, but for the survivors, the memories remain just as vivid. Some of them have spoken out, sharing the stories of what it was like to endure the constant threat of U-boats and bombers, of seeing the light of the enemy's torpedo in the distance, of feeling the shudder of a ship as it was struck. Others, however, never fully shared their experiences. For them, the trauma was something too painful to relive, something better left unsaid. But even if the words remained unspoken, the impact of their service and sacrifice was never lost on those who knew them. The convoys left a mark on the men who survived that could never be erased. It wasn't just about the physical wounds. It was the deep emotional scars they carried. It was the loss of friends, the sound of waves crashing over the side of a ship, the distant howls of a storm that seemed endless, and the cold that never truly left. The survivors, though they may have returned home, never truly returned to the life they once knew. For many of these men, the memories of the North Atlantic convoys stayed with them for the rest of their lives, and as they grew older, they began to see how vital it was to pass on their stories. They understood that the next generation needed to know what had been sacrificed, not just for them, but for the future of the world. It was their mission, even as their ranks dwindled, to ensure that the legacy of the convoys would live on. For they knew that the convoys weren't just a footnote in history, they were a cornerstone of Allied victory. Without the relentless dedication of these men, Britain's survival would have been uncertain, and the course of the war would have been entirely different. As the survivors began to pass on, the importance of their stories grew. The convoys, once considered a largely overlooked part of the war effort, became something more. They were recognized not just for their strategic importance, but for the courage and sacrifice of the men who fought through them. The survivors, though fewer in number, remained passionate about sharing their experiences, helping others understand the incredible burden they had carried and the bravery it had taken to press on day after day, even in the face of almost certain death. And even as the recognition grew, the sense of fulfillment for the veterans was bittersweet. Many of them had already lived through years of trauma before any acknowledgement came. For some, the honor was long overdue, but for others, it was enough to know that their contribution was finally appreciated. They had done their part. They had answered the call when the world needed them most. And while they may have never fully understood the impact of their actions, they knew they had helped shape history in ways that would be felt for generations to come. The veterans, having seen their role in the convoys acknowledged, now passed their story on to their children and grandchildren. And for the first time, those younger generations began to understand the full scope of what the men had gone through. It wasn't just about history. It was about sacrifice, about survival, about doing the unimaginable for a cause greater than oneself. The legacy of the North Atlantic convoys was something more than just historical fact. It was a living testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Through books, documentaries, and personal stories, the story of the convoys is now being shared with the world. And while no amount of recognition can truly repay the debt owed to those men, the acknowledgement is a step toward ensuring that their sacrifices are never forgotten. Their story has finally found its place in the history of World War II, and as time goes on, we continue to learn from their example. It is a story of enduring courage in the face of overwhelming adversity, of strength in the midst of terror, and of the unbreakable will to survive. As we move forward, we should never forget the lessons these men taught us. They showed us what true heroism looks like, not in the form of dramatic speeches or iconic battles, but in the quiet, steadfast courage of men who faced the unimaginable and kept fighting, kept surviving, kept moving forward. The North Atlantic convoys will forever be a symbol of the extraordinary things ordinary men can accomplish when they are asked to face the impossible. So, as we remember the legacy of the North Atlantic convoys, we honor those who sailed them, not just for what they did, but for who they were. Their courage, their sacrifice, and their resilience are the foundation of the world we live in today. And their story will continue to inspire generations, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, humanity can rise above. As the veterans of the North Atlantic convoys entered their twilight years, the recognition of their contributions became more widespread, but it was not without a complex blend of emotions. For those who had lived through the convoys, the sense of closure was elusive. Their experience was one defined not just by the harrowing dangers of battle, but by the emotional and psychological toll of having witnessed such extreme conditions. The war had ended, but its weight continued to linger in their hearts and minds. Long after the warships had docked and the battles were won, in the quiet corners of their homes, where family and friends no longer feared the bombings or the cold waves of the sea, the survivors often found themselves staring into the distance, lost in thoughts of comrades gone too soon. Though they had emerged physically intact from the horrors of the North Atlantic, it was the emotional cost of what they had witnessed that had truly shaped them. The faces of fallen comrades, the screams in the cold waters, and the constant pressure of knowing that survival was never certain. The memories of those moments were never far away. The veterans knew that they couldn't simply erase these memories. It wasn't something they could talk about easily after all. The world had moved on, and how could anyone understand the constant tension of waiting for death to strike from beneath the waves or above the clouds? How could they explain the suffocating loneliness of being out on the open sea, feeling the constant threat of annihilation hanging over them every minute of every day? In their quiet moments, the survivors still carried the mental weight of their experiences. It was a burden they'd never asked for, but one they'd learned to carry because there was no choice. For them, survival had been the only option. In the years after the war, some of the veterans found peace by reconnecting with their families and integrating back into civilian life. They learned how to love again, how to create a life of normalcy after so many years of uncertainty. But for others, the scars were too deep. relationships suffered. Some wrestled with depression, others with anger. The trauma of war wasn't easily mended, and for many, the idea of truly returning to the life they had once known was a near impossibility. Yet, despite the personal battles they fought within themselves, they understood the importance of passing on their story. They knew that the next generation had to hear about the sacrifices they made, and so many of the survivors found solace in sharing their experiences. They spoke to schools, wrote letters, and participated in reunions where they met with others who had sailed those same dangerous waters. Though the pain was still raw, they shared their memories because they realized that their story was bigger than just them. It was a story that needed to be told. The legacy of the North Atlantic convoys had to live on, not just in history books, but in the hearts and minds of those who could never fully understand what it had been like to sail through those dark waters. As new generations came to learn about the convoys, a sense of pride began to grow. What had once been a silent and largely forgotten chapter in World War II became, over time, one of the most celebrated and honored missions of the war. The men who had sailed those convoys were finally given the recognition they deserved in the form of medals, awards, and memorials. The governments of the Allied nations, particularly Britain, began to recognize the incredible contribution these men had made in keeping the war effort alive. The sacrifices of these veterans were finally being celebrated, though they were now too old to bask in the spotlight of recognition. There were commemorations where former sailors of the convoys stood proudly, though with quiet humility, alongside their fellow comrades. The celebrations were important, not just as a way of honoring their service, but as a means of ensuring that future generations knew the true cost of war, the cost, not just in military strategy, but in the lives of the men who fought in the shadows. The convoys were no longer just a series of dangerous sea routes. They were a story of survival, brotherhood, and the quiet heroism of men who had faced overwhelming odds and still made it through. Still, there was something bittersweet about this recognition. For many of these men, the reward wasn't in the recognition, it was in the survival, in the knowledge that their efforts had helped sustain the Allied war effort. They had done their duty, and that was enough for them. To receive medals or accolades was a small but meaningful gesture, but for many, it was the memory of lost comrades, the shared bond with those who had sailed beside them that meant more than anything. The medals might shine, but the real honor lay in the quiet moments of camaraderie, the moments when they knew they had fought not just for victory, but for each other. As they reached the twilight of their lives, the survivors of the North Atlantic convoys passed on a legacy of courage, resilience, and sacrifice. Their story became an integral part of the historical fabric of World War II, reminding us that even in the coldest, most unforgiving circumstances, humanity can endure. These men weren't celebrated for seeking fame or glory. They were celebrated for doing what had to be done, and doing it with a resolve that even the most extreme dangers couldn't break. Their story serves as a reminder of the sacrifices that often go unrecognized. Their bravery, though quiet, was no less important than the more publicized victories of the war. In fact, it may have been even more significant because their efforts kept Britain alive in the most crucial days of the conflict. Without them, without the relentless courage of the convoys, victory may not have been possible. And so, as we look back on the history of the North Atlantic convoys, we honor those who sailed them, not just for what they did, but for who they were. They were the unsung heroes of World War II, and their legacy is one that will forever resonate in the hearts of those who understand the true meaning of sacrifice. As the last survivors of the North Atlantic convoys reached the end of their journeys, the story they left behind continued to echo through the generations. The war had ended decades ago, but for those who had lived it, especially the sailors who had braved the relentless dangers of those convoys, the impact of their service remained a lasting presence. The emotional weight of those years would not fade with time, and the memories of what they had endured were never truly left behind. These men had been to the edge of humanity's endurance, tested beyond the limits of what most could even imagine, and they had survived. But even with the decades that had passed, the emotional scars and memories of the sea were ever present for many of them. The men who sailed those treacherous waters had been asked to endure extreme hardship, from the constant threat of death lurking in the deep to the bone-chilling cold that seeped into their very souls. And while some were able to move forward, to live a life of relative peace after the war, for others, the psychological toll of what they had seen and survived could never fully be erased. The survivors began to reflect more on what they had lost, not just the lives of their comrades, but the peace of themselves that had been left behind in the cold waters of the North Atlantic. Many found themselves seeking out one another in their later years, attending reunions, meeting with old friends who had sailed those same treacherous routes. These reunions became more than just opportunities for nostalgia. They were moments of shared understanding, where words were often unnecessary. A simple look could convey a depth of experience that words could never reach. The bonds formed between these men during the war were like no other. They had lived through the worst together, and that shared history was something that could not be easily put into words. For some survivors, those memories became part of their family legacies. Children and grandchildren grew up hearing stories about their fathers, grandfathers, and great-grandfathers who had faced the brutal challenges of the convoys. These families came to understand the quiet strength of the veterans, their reluctance to talk about the war, but also their immense pride in the role they had played. Through these personal accounts, the significance of the convoys began to be recognized, not just by history books, but by the families who carried on the legacy of those men. Over time, the survivors' experiences, once kept largely to themselves, were shared with the broader public. Documentaries, books, and public commemorations began to tell the story of the convoys and their essential role in the war. Schools and museums began to include these men's sacrifices in their teachings, ensuring that future generations understood what had been done to secure their freedom. This recognition, though it came many years after the fact, became a bittersweet reminder of the sacrifices made by the men who had never asked for accolades or fame. Despite all this recognition, the question still lingered: why did these men do it? What drove them to press on when everything in the world seemed stacked against them? The answer, perhaps, lies in the same reason the sailors had embarked on those harrowing journeys in the first place: duty. Duty to each other, duty to their countries, duty to the idea of freedom itself. The survival of Britain and the Allies rested on these convoys. Without them, the war would have become far more difficult, if not impossible, to win. And so they sailed. They faced the cold, the fear, and the constant threat of death, because they understood that their mission was critical. The North Atlantic convoys were more than just logistical operations. They were a demonstration of the human spirit's capacity to endure. The men who sailed them weren't professional soldiers or trained combatants. They were just men, men with families, with hopes, with dreams of a peaceful future. And yet, they became warriors in the most unexpected of ways, not by choice, but by necessity. They did not seek glory, they sought survival. And in doing so, they achieved something far greater than what any medals or accolades could represent. Their legacy now serves as a constant reminder of the sacrifices that ordinary men can make when faced with the most extraordinary of circumstances. The North Atlantic convoys remain one of the most significant and often overlooked contributions to the Allied victory, and the men who sailed those waters will always be remembered as the true unsung heroes of World War II. Their bravery helped shape the world we live in today, a world where the lessons of survival, camaraderie, and unyielding courage continue to inspire those who face their own battles, no matter how daunting. The war may have ended decades ago, but the lesson of the North Atlantic convoys is timeless. It speaks to the enduring human spirit, to the ability to push forward when every instinct tells you to stop, to keep going even when the path ahead seems impossible. The men who sailed those convoys didn't just fight for victory, they fought for a world that would be free from tyranny. And their success, achieved through countless sacrifices, is something that we can never take for granted. As we continue to move forward, it's vital to keep the memory of these men alive. Their sacrifices were not just part of a military operation, they were part of the story of humanity's resilience in the face of unimaginable hardship. The North Atlantic convoys were the lifeblood of the Allied war effort, and the sailors who sailed them were the ones who ensured that victory against all odds was possible. These men didn't just survive, they became a living testament to the power of the human will. And as we honor their legacy, we remember that even in the darkest times, the human spirit can rise above. The convoys may have ended, but their story lives on, carried forward by the lessons they imparted, the bravery they displayed, and the unshakable courage that defined them. They were the silent defenders of freedom, and their legacy will continue to inspire generations to come. As the years continued to pass, the legacy of the North Atlantic convoys became a cornerstone of remembrance, not just for the veterans, but for all who understood the true cost of the war. Yet, the survivors were not just historical figures. They were real people, men who had lived through unimaginable hardship, and their stories were as varied as the waters they had sailed. Each man brought his own personal tale of courage, loss, and survival. And as those stories were passed down, they began to form a collective narrative, one that weaved the individual sacrifices into a larger, shared history. The recognition of the convoys, while long overdue, became a source of pride for the survivors, even as the memory of their comrades, who did not make it home, still lingered in their hearts. Public commemorations, memorials, and educational programs helped ensure that the younger generations understood the vital role that these convoys played in the Allied war effort. Yet, for many of the veterans, it was never about the medals or the public recognition. The real reward was the knowledge that they had been part of something that had made a difference in the world. The story of the North Atlantic convoys isn't just one of military strategy or logistical triumph. It's one of unrelenting perseverance. It's a story of how ordinary men, thrown into extraordinary circumstances, can rise to meet the challenges of war. It's a story about the resilience of the human spirit when faced with overwhelming odds. And as the veterans grew older, it became clear that the true significance of their sacrifices could never be fully measured in terms of victory alone. They had fought for survival, Yes, but more than that. They had fought for each other, for the world they hoped to return to, and for a future where their families could live without the fear of tyranny. In the later years of their lives, many of the veterans found comfort in knowing that their story would be remembered. They shared their experiences with younger generations, passing on the lessons learned from the cold, dangerous waters of the North Atlantic. They wanted future generations to understand not just the heroism of the convoys, but the humanity behind the bravery. They wanted the world to know that victory wasn't won by a few high-profile battles or the heroic actions of famous generals. It was won by the men who sailed the convoys, who faced down death every single day, and who ensured that the lifeline to Britain remained intact. But even as the story of the convoys was more widely recognized, many veterans found that the acknowledgement, though meaningful, did not remove the weight of their memories. The trauma, the loss, the fear of those years, those things never really disappeared. Some men continued to wrestle with the emotional scars of the war, and even as the world celebrated their survival and bravery, the veterans found that the war was something they would carry with them for the rest of their lives. The emotional toll of the convoys was perhaps the most difficult part of the experience to understand. The sailors, who had faced the U-boats, the bombers, and the freezing waters, had not only survived the most dangerous waters in the world, they had carried the weight of the lives lost along the way. Every time a ship was struck, every time a friend fell, it was a burden they carried. The fear of not making it back, the tension of knowing that death could strike at any moment, was something no one outside of that experience could truly comprehend. For many of these men, returning home was not a return to normal. It was an attempt to fit their lives back into a world that had moved on while they remained trapped in the memories of war. And yet, for all the challenges of reintegration, for all the trauma that lingered, these men never lost sight of the greater purpose of their mission. They had been part of something extraordinary. They had sailed through one of the most dangerous parts of the war, and their courage had been instrumental in ensuring victory. They had been the silent defenders, the ones who kept the war effort alive when the odds seemed insurmountable. And in the end, they had helped shape the world into a better place, a place where freedom could flourish and tyranny could be defeated. For the veterans, the recognition that followed the war, while appreciated, could never fully repay the debt of their sacrifice. The true honor came not in the medals or the public ceremonies, but in the quiet pride of knowing that they had played a critical role in securing the world's future. They had survived the impossible, and their legacy was one of unwavering courage in the face of darkness. The story of the North Atlantic convoys is not just a tale of survival, it is a testament to the enduring strength of the human spirit. These men faced unimaginable adversity, yet they pressed on, undeterred by the dangers they encountered. And as we continue to reflect on their story, we must remember that it is not just about the convoys, it is about the people who sailed them, the men who carried the weight of the world on their shoulders, and who, despite everything, never gave up. Their legacy is one of courage, sacrifice, and brotherhood. It's a legacy that will live on in the memories of those who continue to tell their stories, in the hearts of those who recognize the immense cost of freedom, and in the lessons we carry forward. The North Atlantic convoys may have ended, but their impact will echo through time, reminding us of the resilience it takes to face the most difficult of circumstances and the unbreakable will to survive. As the final chapters of the North Atlantic convoy story unfold, it becomes clear that the significance of these missions was far greater than initially recognized. The convoys were not just a logistical necessity, they were a defining symbol of the Allied war effort. The men who sailed them demonstrated a level of courage, resilience, and perseverance that not only helped tip the scales of war, but also defined the essence of collective sacrifice. They may not have been hailed as heroes during their time on the convoys, but in hindsight, we see that their contribution was monumental. What many don't realize is how deeply the experience of these sailors marked the post-war years. For the survivors, it wasn't just a matter of celebrating the end of the war and returning to civilian life. The emotional cost was significant, and it lingered long after the torpedoed ships had sunk to the bottom of the sea, long after the last Focke-Wulf Condor had flown off into the distance. The survivors returned to their families, but they brought with them more than just their physical injuries. They brought emotional scars that, for some, would never fully heal. The horrors they had witnessed, the chaos of an attack, the cold and despair of watching a ship go down, the desperate screams of comrades lost to the freezing waters stayed with them. The men who had braved the North Atlantic were not just survivors of war, they were witnesses to a kind of terror that few could comprehend. For them, the battle didn't end with the signing of peace treaties or the return to civilian life. The scars of war followed them, etched into their memories, a constant reminder of what they had endured. It wasn't just the terror of being in the crosshairs of a U-boat or bombers from above. It was the quiet, unspoken anxiety that haunted them during every voyage. The constant tension of knowing that death could come from anywhere beneath the water, from the skies, or even from nature itself, as the cold waves of the North Atlantic continued to rage. It was the loss of comrades, those who had sailed beside them, shared their meals, and laughed about trivial things in the midst of their war-induced fatigue, now gone forever. And for those who returned home, there was the burden of knowing that their survival came at the cost of so many others. And yet, despite the weight of their memories, the survivors pressed on. In the quiet moments of their later years, they found solace in the knowledge that their mission had been a success. They had played a crucial role in keeping Britain alive during the darkest days of the war. They had delivered the supplies needed to fuel the war effort, ensuring that Britain could continue to resist the Axis powers. Without them, victory would have been delayed, perhaps even impossible. They may not have been the ones to storm the beaches of Normandy or liberate concentration camps, but without their sacrifice, those moments of glory would not have been possible. These sailors, who had sailed through the most dangerous waters in the world, had been the unsung heroes, the lifeblood of the war effort. And as the survivors reached the end of their lives, they understood that their story would continue to resonate through the generations. It was not just a story of survival, but one of unyielding courage, of brotherhood, and of the human capacity to persevere even in the face of overwhelming odds. As the years went on, more and more people began to understand the true cost of the North Atlantic convoys. The survivors were recognized not just as veterans of war, but as symbols of human resilience. Memorials were erected, books were written, and documentaries were made to ensure that the sacrifices made by these men would never be forgotten. The veterans, though few in number, attended reunions, shared their stories, and ensured that the younger generations understood the significance of what had been accomplished. But no amount of recognition, no medals, no ceremonies could undo the emotional weight carried by these men. The scars they carried would never fade, and that was a part of their journey too. It wasn't just about the physical battles they had fought, it was about the emotional journey of survival, the inner conflict of living with the memories of war, and the courage it took to go on even when the wounds were invisible. Today, as we remember the North Atlantic convoys, we do so not just with gratitude, but with reverence. We understand that the victory of World War II was not simply won on the beaches of Normandy or in the skies over Britain. It was won in the freezing, windswept waters of the North Atlantic, where ordinary men were asked to do the extraordinary. These men, who sailed through perilous conditions day in and day out, were not just delivering cargo, they were delivering hope. Their efforts allowed Britain to stay in the fight, and ultimately, they helped bring about the defeat of Nazi Germany. The legacy of the North Atlantic convoys is one of quiet heroism, of duty and sacrifice that went largely unrecognized for many years. But now, as we look back, we see their story in its full scope. We understand that the victory of World War II was won not just by soldiers on the front lines, but by the men who sailed those cold, dangerous waters. And their story will never be forgotten. It is a story of unyielding courage, of resilience in the face of unimaginable odds, and of the incredible strength of the human spirit. As we continue to reflect on the lessons of the convoys, let us remember that heroism is often not found in grand gestures or famous battles. Sometimes it is found in the quiet determination of ordinary men who, when faced with impossible odds, rise to meet the challenge. The North Atlantic convoys were the unsung backbone of the Allied victory, and the men who sailed them will always be remembered as the true heroes of World War II. As the final pages of the North Atlantic convoy story turn, it is clear that the legacy of these men will never fade. The convoys may have ended, the ships may have docked, and the world moved on to new challenges, but the spirit of those who sailed those dangerous waters endures in the hearts of their families, in the memories of their fellow sailors, and in the history books that now tell their story. For the veterans of these convoys, time has allowed some healing, but it has never allowed them to forget. Many have left us now, their ranks thinning with every passing year, but their stories live on as a reminder of the extraordinary courage displayed by ordinary men. These were not men seeking fame or glory. They were men who faced death on a daily basis, not because they had to, but because they knew that their survival meant the survival of so much more. The very future of Britain, the stability of the Allied war effort, and the eventual defeat of Nazi Germany rested, in part, on their willingness to sail into harm's way. The final survivors are few, but as they continue to pass on their stories, the younger generations can now grasp the full scope of their sacrifice. The history of these convoys has taken its rightful place in the larger narrative of World War II. It is no longer a forgotten chapter, it is a central one. The contributions of the sailors who sailed these lifelines across the North Atlantic are now understood for what they were: indispensable, heroic, and ultimately vital to the war effort. In the final years of their lives, many of the veterans began to reflect on what they had achieved. There was no grand celebration when the war ended. They weren't the ones who stormed the beaches, made history in the newspapers, or earned medals on the front lines. Their victories weren't marked by dramatic speeches or iconic images. They were the quiet heroes, the ones who kept the supply lines open, ensuring that victory was even possible, and that was enough for them. The veterans didn't need grand parades or extensive accolades. They understood the weight of their actions. They knew that without their perseverance, the war could have been lost. They didn't fight for recognition. They fought because they had a duty to fulfill, because their mission was life or death, and because they wanted to protect the freedoms that everyone else took for granted. They didn't have time for anything else. Survival, for them, was the only priority. Yet, as the survivors aged, the recognition grew. People began to understand the crucial role the convoys played, and with that came a surge of respect and admiration. Governments, historians, and veterans groups worked to ensure that the memory of the convoys and their sailors would live on. Memorials were built, awards given, and documentaries produced. But for the veterans, who had endured the war in silence, the most important recognition was the acknowledgement that they had been part of something much larger than themselves, a victory that shaped the future of the world. But even as the world celebrated their heroism, the men who had lived through the convoys knew the true cost of their journey. Their service was never not just the lives of their comrades, but the peace of themselves that had been left behind in the cold waters of the North Atlantic. Many found themselves seeking out one another in their later years, attending reunions, meeting with old friends who had sailed those same treacherous routes. These reunions became more than just opportunities for nostalgia. They were moments of shared understanding, where words were often unnecessary. A simple look could convey a depth of experience that words could never reach. The bonds formed between these men during the war were like no other. They had lived through the worst together, and that shared history was something that could not be easily put into words. For some survivors, those memories became part of their family legacies. Children and grandchildren grew up hearing stories about their fathers, grandfathers, and great-grandfathers who had faced the brutal challenges of the convoys. These families came to understand the quiet strength of the veterans, their reluctance to talk about the war, but also their immense pride in the role they had played. Through these personal accounts, the significance of the convoys began to be recognized, not just by history books, but by the families who carried on the legacy of those men. Over time, the survivors' experiences, once kept largely to themselves, were shared with the broader public. Documentaries, books, and public commemorations began to tell the story of the convoys and their essential role in the war. Schools and museums began to include these men's sacrifices in their teachings, ensuring that future generations understood what had been done to secure their freedom. This recognition, though it came many years after the fact, became a bittersweet reminder of the sacrifices made by the men who had never asked for accolades or fame. Despite all this recognition, the question still lingered: why did these men do it? What drove them to press on when everything in the world seemed stacked against them? The answer, perhaps, lies in the same reason the sailors had embarked on those harrowing journeys in the first place: duty. Duty to each other, duty to their countries, duty to the idea of freedom itself. The survival of Britain and the Allies rested on these convoys. Without them, the war would have become far more difficult, if not impossible, to win. And so they sailed. They faced the cold, the fear, and the constant threat of death, because they understood that their mission was critical. The North Atlantic convoys were more than just logistical operations. They were a demonstration of the human spirit's capacity to endure. The men who sailed them weren't professional soldiers or trained combatants. They were just men with families, with hopes, with dreams of a peaceful future. And yet, they became warriors in the most unexpected of ways, not by choice, but by necessity. They did not seek glory, they sought survival. And in doing so, they achieved something far greater than what any medals or accolades could represent. Their legacy now serves as a constant reminder of the sacrifices that ordinary men can make when faced with the most extraordinary of circumstances. The North Atlantic convoys remain one of the most significant and often overlooked contributions to the Allied victory, and the men who sailed those waters will always be remembered as the true unsung heroes of World War II. Their bravery helped shape the world we live in today, a world where the lessons of survival, camaraderie, and unyielding courage continue to inspire those who face their own battles, no matter how daunting. The war may have ended decades ago, but the lesson of the North Atlantic convoys is timeless. It speaks to the enduring human spirit, to the ability to push forward when every instinct tells you to stop, to keep going even when the path ahead seems impossible. The men who sailed those convoys didn't just fight for victory, they fought for a world that would be free from tyranny. And their success, achieved through countless sacrifices, is something that we can never take for granted. As we continue to move forward, it's vital to keep the memory of these men alive. Their sacrifices were not just part of a military operation. They were part of the story of humanity's resilience in the face of unimaginable hardship. The North Atlantic convoys were the lifeblood of the Allied war effort, and the sailors who sailed them were the ones who ensured that victory against all odds was possible. These men didn't just survive, they became a living testament to the power of the human will. And as we honor their legacy, we remember that even in the darkest times, the human spirit can rise above. The convoys may have ended, but their story lives on, carried forward by the lessons they imparted, the bravery they displayed, and the unshakable courage that defined them. They were the silent defenders of freedom, and their legacy will continue to inspire generations to come. As the years continued to pass, the legacy of the North Atlantic convoys became a cornerstone of remembrance, not just for the veterans, but for all who understood the true cost of the war. Yet, the survivors were not just historical figures. They were real people, men who had lived through unimaginable hardship, and their stories were as varied as the waters they had sailed. Each man brought his own personal tale of courage, loss, and survival. And as those stories were passed down, they began to form a collective narrative, one that weaved the individual sacrifices into a larger, shared history. The recognition of the convoys, while long overdue, became a source of pride for the survivors, even as the memory of their comrades, who did not make it home, still lingered in their hearts. Public commemorations, memorials, and educational programs helped ensure about medals or recognition. It was about duty, survival, and brotherhood. It was about the sense of purpose that drove them forward each day, despite the overwhelming odds. And even as the world slowly began to understand the significance of their sacrifice, the emotional burden they carried would remain with them forever. For many of these men, the real battle wasn't fought in the trenches or at sit, was fought within themselves. It was the battle to survive, to process the trauma, and to find peace after so many years of conflict. And while the convoys may have ended, their impact continues. The lessons they taught us about the importance of survival, about perseverance in the face of overwhelming odds, and about the bonds that are formed in times of great hardship, lessons that resonate to this day. We live in a world where we are reminded daily of the costs of freedom and the price that was paid by those who fought for it. The sailors of the North Atlantic convoys may not have sought fame or recognition, but in the end, they are remembered for the very thing they never expected: their unshakable courage and their willingness to do what was necessary to secure a future for everyone else. As the final chapter of their story is told, we remember these men for what they were: unsung heroes whose sacrifice and determination were essential to the Allied victory. They showed us that heroism isn't always about grand battles or famous victories. Sometimes it's about the quiet courage of those who sail into the unknown, who fight when the odds are stacked against them, and who endure through the toughest trials because they believe in the cause. The legacy of the North Atlantic convoys is a legacy of ordinary men doing the extraordinary, and their story will continue to inspire future generations. The convoys ended, but their story never will. The men who sailed them may have returned home, but their place in history is now secure. We honor them not just for what they did, but for who they were: brave, determined, and unflinching in the face of unimaginable danger. Their sacrifices were integral to the Allied victory, and their courage remains a beacon of what it means to fight for something greater than yourself. So, as we remember the North Atlantic convoys and the men who sailed them, we do so with gratitude, with respect, and with the understanding that their story is one of the greatest untold chapters in the history of World War II. The legacy of these men will live on in the history we pass down, in the lessons we continue to learn, and in the lessons we continue to learn, and in the freedoms we continue to cherish.